Hi, today I'm speaking to Zion Lights. She's a science communicator, founder of Emergency Reactor, and former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. She's lectured at Oxford and Cambridge, is a published author, and a leading voice in pro nuclear climate advocacy. Welcome to the show.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, we're going to be focusing this conversation on nuclear energy, but I wanted to start with a little bit of personal background.
Mhm.
And so in 2015, the Telegraph called you Britain's greenest mother. And you've curated a lifestyle that involved secondhand clothing, a vegan diet, upcycled toys and books, public transit, no driving, everything you could do to basically decrease your carbon footprint. So you were like a full-blown climate activist as well, or environmental activist. Uh, I think you might have even been arrested.
Yep,
Yes,
that's
okay, I
correct.
got that one right. So, how did you get to be on that level of environmental or climate activism?
So I think the main thing is that I was very passionate about environmental issues from a very young age. But I grew up in an environment where kind of the people around me didn't really care about those issues, and that's not speaking, badly about them. I'd say it was completely legitimate. They had other concerns. I'm from a very working class family, and my parents were immigrants to Britain, and they fled poverty in India. So their concerns were very much, how do we get off this council estate, and how do we pay the bills, and how do we feed our kids, and how do we, upskill so that we have good jobs, although they were factory workers their whole lives until they retired. So it was really odd for me to care about the issues that I cared about in that space because people really had different priorities. So naturally, as I got older, and I started looking into kind of where are these communities, is there anyone out there who thinks like me? I came across the kind of typical environmental groups. So Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, even, some non-environmental groups like Amnesty International. I joined them. I joined a lot of groups where I just felt like these are probably my people. These people probably understand why I'm worried about global warming, which is what we called it at the time, why I'm worried about species going extinct and all this stuff. I was very young. And, back then, just like suggesting how old I am here, you didn't really sign up online. You kind of found your local group, and you found them typically through leaflets. Like I'd go to the library and there'd be leaflets pinned up on the board, and it would say, the local Friends of the Earth meets on these days in these places. So I was very immediately absorbed into those communities because they were like, wow, young person who really cares about these issues. And I had a very different background to most of them because that movement, typically, even now, the environmental movement is very, middle class, and that wasn't my kind of background. I was from the inner city. I was from a really rundown, deprived area, actually. Although, I was too young to really understand that at the time. I just kind of went, what do we do to fix this? And I trusted these groups to have the answers. And
Why was that the thing that caught your attention? Like, there's obviously a lot of different types of issues around and people care about. Why was that specifically the one that drew you in?
so climate change, I learned about climate change at school, and I was always very interested in science. So, we didn't know as much back then when I was at school as we do now, but we knew that, like, if we don't do something about this, it's going to be a huge problem later down the line, and all these animals will be affected, and the environment will be affected, and humans will be affected. And I'd say I was a very sensitive kind of child, and I really cared about those issues. And just, I think it was kind of fed by the fact that no one around me understood, and they were like, "Oh, she's being weird again. She's saying we should recycle." Again, back then it wasn't normal. That's actually become very normal now, and pretty much everybody does it. But back then it wasn't. So me trying to urge my parents to like collect bottles and take them to the bottle bank was a really weird thing. So partly it was that. It was that um, there were lots of different issues I cared about, but maybe the people around me agreed about, everybody agrees we should end world hunger. And obviously that concerned me too, right? Like all of those kind of issues concerned me too. But that was the one where I felt like nobody's listening. And I've just learned that scientists are really concerned. And if nobody around me is listening, then that means, what if nobody's doing anything about it? I would say I had eco-anxiety. It wasn't, we didn't really call it that back then, which is why it was a really weird thing for everyone around me. But that's what it was. So that propelled me into these groups. And I would say that, to answer your first question, how did I become Britain's greenest mother, as they dubbed me? Not that that was scientifically, proven or anything, but it was because I learned from these groups, like almost like, here's a checklist. If you tick everything in this box, good job, you did it. You're the best environmentalist, you win. And I was young and I was a teenager, and I just followed this list. Like, I'm going to sign a pledge to give up flying. I'm going to give up meat. And again, back then, that was really uncommon. It was very uncommon to be vegan. You couldn't get soya milk in Starbucks. You couldn't get it anywhere, actually. You had to like mail order a powder that you had to mix into like a paste. Anyway.
Now you have to pay a surcharge for it. So.
Yeah. But now it is readily available now. So now it's more normal. But I basically followed this checklist because I was tricked essentially into believing like, yeah, if I do all these things, I've done my bit and I won't feel bad anymore. But actually what happened is, I ended up realizing that was just a lie. Essentially, that was a lie. And although I exceeded at that lie, I published a book on it and everything, it didn't solve the problem. And not only that, but even if everybody lived with a low carbon footprint, like I was kind of advocating for in that book, it still wouldn't solve the problem. And that's where I got a little bit miffed years later, when it dawned on me. But you can see from that article, not only that one, but it's also in the Guardian, gave me a glowing review about that book. Just shows how much you're rewarded for doing those actions. Like, yes, look, this person has ticked all the boxes in the checklist, so they must be the person that we'll celebrate and we'll reward. But it's kind of like virtue signaling, really, isn't it?
It is. It has that element for sure. But also, as I was listening to you, I was sort of struck by, like, the world can feel very overwhelming, right? Like it feels like it's out to get us sometimes. And especially if you're really concerned about these things around climate and see the danger of it, you feel like you get a sense of power, I would say, from here you have something that's within your control, a list that you can follow, and one side of it is like, oh, you're a good person for following it, but also the second aspect, I think, is like that sense of control in a world that feels very much out of control. Does that resonate?
Absolutely. And I was, before that, I was very lost, I would say. Like, I just didn't know what I should be doing. And now I think about it, I could have become an environmental scientist. I could have become a nuclear scientist. But those options weren't on the table for me, not with my background and the people that I was surrounded with. Everyone I knew worked in like manual labor. I was not in the. And then when I went into those groups of those people who, they, the middle class people, they have a lot more options in life, maybe. They'd rejected all that. Because they were like, capitalism's bad. You don't want to have wealth. Well, that's okay for you because you grew up in wealth, so now you can rebel against it. Some of us have a different perspective, but it took me a long time to realize and to work out, like, why is your perspective so different. And to be honest, even when I was in Extinction Rebellion, I remember being asked to come in and be the spokesperson, and this was after years of kind of not being involved in these groups because I'd sort of just given up on them, and thinking, maybe could they be different? Maybe they're different. And then kind of stepping into that group and thinking, oh, they're just the same arguments and the same stuff, and all from the same sort of people who are quite happy to have control over like their personal consumption because they come from a background where they had excess, right? It's like rebellion for them and control. For me, where we didn't have abundance, I actually really liked the idea of abundance, but I couldn't do it without guilt because I was told for years, well, that's a bad thing. Why do you want consumerism? So I was buying things but secondhand, for example. But a lot of that changed as I grew up, and I thankfully became exposed to other voices as well. But then it was hard because, like, those were all my people. This is my community for
Mm.
years and years. And it's like, well, do I now just say, see you, I don't agree, bye. I was arrested with you. You know, I sat on picket lines with you. We stayed up late making leaflets together. We're friends. I partied with you. Do we just say goodbye? And essentially, when I came out advocating for nuclear power, that is what I risked and what I did to some extent. Not that I lost everybody, but to some extent. It's inevitable, right? Because you're going against like a group ideology and
Yeah, and
identity.
for sure, and that's a really big thing I've observed in there's studies where it's like, why do people not change their minds, right? It's not always about the actual topic; it's actually about the community that they've built around it. So, like, if somebody's a flat
Mm,
earther, for example, it's not just about that theory of flat Earth. It's like if they have doubt, they lose their entire community that they become friends with, kind of these outsiders or insiders with, right?
mm.
And that plays a significant role. Um, do you still keep some of these? Do you still recycle? I guess is the question I want
I
to
do,
ask.
yes, I do. But I know that some people don't like the idea of recycling, and I know that in some areas it's been found like not to be productive. But where
Hmm.
I live, I have been to the recycling center on a tour where they like show how they sort the waste and they show what they use it for. Some of it they repurpose, and some of it, and these are people with good jobs, and I think that's brilliant. So for me, that like it's not just a tick box anymore. I've thought through every little thing and made a decision based on it. Um, and with that, I decided yes. But other things, I never learned to drive because I was just like ideologically against it. And now I think, well, my life would be a lot easier if I could drive, especially when I want to get out to remote places, which is, I love nature and I love being out in nature. Actually, it can be really difficult to get to those sorts of places on just bus and train schedules. And yeah, or, long cycle ride. And yeah, I have done those things in the past, but um sometimes I kick myself and think, well, maybe that, how much did I really contribute to anything by taking one car off the road? And I know what the response to that is, which is, well, if everyone thought like that. But the fact is everyone else does think like that, and everyone else does get to go out in nature and have day trips to places, and not get drenched in the rain waiting for a bus for 3 hours. And then they'll say, well, then we could fix the buses. Yeah, we could. We could fix everything with solar panels and bus systems and
Hmm.
batteries. But is that the reality of what we're living now? That's
And
that's when you drop the ideology, you really have to drop the idealism a little bit as well. And I know that's really hard for some people to hear, but it's just growing up, isn't it?
yeah, and it's a balance, right? I actually am someone who got my driver's license pretty late in life. And it's completely changed my life because of the freedom to move is a significant freedom, and it has
Mm,
helped me tremendously with work opportunities as well, because I had some roles where I had to be on location. I wouldn't have been able to get there by
mm,
public transit. It would take hours or it would be impossible to reach.
yeah.
um, that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to improve, public transit or encourage, I love these programs with the bicycles, where you can just rent, it's
Mm. Yeah,
very
we have those too.
cheap, right? Yeah, which price is a big factor too, because I used them in France and I used them in Budapest, and they're so widely available and affordable there. Where I am now, they've recently introduced it and I was really excited. And then I looked at the price, it
Mm,
was very, very high. So it was like a luxury, almost, right? And
yeah.
yeah, so I think there's like a balance to it. And with public transit, it's like, okay, well, there's issues around public transit. For example, getting sick is an issue for me, and I don't want to get sick. And I've noticed that when I started driving, my illnesses have decreased significantly. But there's also people with immunocompromised who are immunocompromised. They have no choice. It's pretty dangerous, and then costs of it too. It's not necessarily cheaper to take public transit in every place. So there's a lot of elements, and I think there's a lot of like balance that we can have. So there's certain things we can do, or looking at, for example, we use so much plastic. um And instead of, maybe using glass a bit more, but then that also has its own issue, right? Because of weight and transportation. So it's a complicated system. And you one thing that I got from you is that you're very evidence based, right? You're now, and especially now, I imagine, because you're sort of looking at, okay, is this just a greenwashing practice as opposed to something that actually can have a real impact? Like, does this thing get actually recycled, or does it ultimately just get dumped in a mass garbage facility for a catch-all kind of facility, right?
Yeah, I try to make choices based on evidence, or at least, as far as my understanding can take me. I don't like go too deeply into things, because you could just end up in a mine, right, of kind of, well, is an EV better, or is it still problematic because of the grid and blah blah blah. I know people who have those, and it's still a car on the road. I know people who still have those battles, and I'm very glad that I'm not someone who assesses things like that anymore. Although I think actually that's why that checklist is kind of useful, because it just tells you in black and white: driving bad, tick; flying bad, tick. And as you say, it's just more complicated than that. But then you can also just get burned out from kind of trying to work out the best thing to do. And what really hit me, to be honest, is just doing all these things for years, and it was a form of self-sacrifice. Like, I'm not saying my life was rubbish or anything like that. I'm not saying that. But there were times I was sacrificing. So say I needed to eat something and I was out with friends. We went into a place that didn't have any options I could eat, and sometimes that happened. Back then, now it's more common. You'll get at least one vegetarian option. Back then, you ask for a vegan option, like you'll just get lettuce. Anyway, I would just not eat. And fine, that was only now and again. But those things started adding up. Oh, I can't go because you can only get to this place by car, and I can't get there. And as they started adding up, it began to feel like a sacrifice. And I began to think, I actually don't like this. I want an easier life. I want to enjoy life. But what this was kind of where the disparity between me and the other people in these groups was, in that they're the people I then went to for advice. I feel bad about this. What do you do? Oh, well, I just always make sure I have nuts and snacks with me. I just make sure, blah, 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 I'll cycle 3 miles in the rain. And I realized that for them, that self-sacrifice was like a badge of honor. Like, that's what it's about. That's what it's about. And that's not what it was about for me, because I came at it from a different angle, and it wasn't about rebellion against the system, right? It was about, like, how can we make people's lives better? I don't like climate change because it's going to make people's lives worse. Well, me making my life worse isn't going to help people over there, right? But that is the argument.
Mm-hmm.
That's just it. You do less, you have less, then that helps that person over there. But it's not really true, isn't it? I mean, in extreme ways it could be true, but that was not my lifestyle. Mine was just an average, kind of a normal lifestyle. I'm not flying off in a private jet anywhere. I'm just being denied access to things because I have chosen to try and abide by these rules, which, to be honest, are really arbitrary. But then, yeah, then there was this kind of clash. So I just kind of go, wow, all my peers are praising me for missing that meal or missing that gathering. So I'm just going to keep doing it because, like, these are my people, and I'm not going to fight with them, because if you fight with them, you're not just fighting about you missed a gathering or you missed a meal. You're fighting about their identity, because they believe this stuff and this is their ideology, and you are fighting that. Then you're out. You're not in that group anymore. Well, I couldn't do that. I've known these people for years. These were like my second family. So yeah, I was trapped in that for a long time, and I did change my mind on nuclear as well a long time ago, over time, because I was looking at kind of the science. I was looking at what I was told by people I trusted and cared about, and then I was looking at the science. But then, even then, as I was changing my mind, there was nowhere for that to go. Like, where am I going to go with that? I'm going to say that on TV? I don't think so. I'm going to say that to my friends? No way. And in fact, there was a time I was a member of the Green Party here, the UK Green Party, and I was pretty involved, and they wanted me to run as a councillor, and again, I was ticking all the boxes, and I actually did ask the leader of the local Green Party group, what her position was on nuclear power. And it was not me shilling for nuclear at all. Not at all. I was curious. And she was so upset even just by that question. We know it's bad, Zion. I remember she put a hand on my shoulder and she said, you're not pro-nuclear, are you? And it was something about that moment that yeah, I mean, I quit the party after that, after this happened, because
so that's the reason you also Extinction Rebellion, you stepped down from that.
But Extinction Rebellion was interesting because not everybody there is anti-nuclear, not everybody there is anti-technology, not everybody there is anti-GMO. So initially, when I was invited into this group, I was kind of in the science. There was like a scientist for exile group, and I was like, these are all scientists. They don't believe in homeopathy, and they're not anti-GMOs, and they're not anti-nuclear energy. And some of them, I completely like vibed with them on this stuff, and I'm still friends with them. So I was like, okay, I can work with this. But they were just, members, and I say members very loosely because we didn't have any kind of official membership. They were not leaders, and the leaders were the same as the people that I'd been trying to escape for a long time, that I'd grown up around but had now tried to escape. And it took me some time to realize that the leadership was very different, and essentially because I got invited in and I became a core member and I was in leadership meetings and I saw what the members didn't see, where they'd be like, well, we act autonomously, there's no leadership, this isn't top down. And I'd say, yeah it is, because I got invited to a donor event that you didn't even know about, where there were huge celebrities there, and we did presentations to try and get money out of them. And we took money from people that I thought was questionable, but it's fine because it's for the cause. And that was with the leadership, and they made all those decisions without you even knowing about it. But it's not a top. So again, I was kind of it's these people again where they don't even practice what they preach because they're all against the man, but they're very quick to fill that space when there's a space to be the man. They're very quick to get in that space, and I'm just over here trying to solve problems. I just want life to be better for people. That's all. I don't care about the ideology. I don't care about the stripes. I don't care about the flag. I don't care about any of that. And anytime I get involved with these groups, I'm basically not a member of anything anymore. I'm like the opposite of Groucho Marx, right? What did he say about you'll never be the member of any group that wants it?
People you're not the opposite. You're with
people want me in their groups, and I don't want to be in their groups, basically. And even recently, I was at an event, a climate week event that I got invited to in London, and I bumped into someone from XR who I hadn't seen since those days. I don't know if she doesn't know my story or if she just doesn't care or what, but she came over and gave me a hug. Hey, do you remember me? I was in the art team. There wasn't a lot of crossover with what I did and her group did, so I didn't see her a lot, but I knew her because she had organized events I'd been at. And we had a really nice conversation, common ground. And I thought that was straight. Like, when you're not in the group, everything's fine. It's fine. We'll just find things we get along with and we can just work it out from there. But as soon as you're in the group setting or you have that tribal identity, then I don't know, you get pushed in a certain direction and then you can't break out of it. So yeah, with Extinction Rebellion, there were people that were unusual, they were new, and a lot of them were new. They were new to, and I think that helped because they didn't have the old kind of. They weren't like the C&D people who were really scared of nuclear, which was the people I'd been hanging out with previously. They're still very middle class, kind of rebellion type. They've grown up with everything, but they feel they have nothing because of capitalism and all that. So there was still that going on, but I had a lot more common ground with them until, again, we diverged because I was asked to speak about what we were doing on TV, and I was asked very directly in an interview about the solutions, and I realized that the solutions I wanted to give, I wasn't allowed to give as a spokesperson. I couldn't talk about nuclear, right? I couldn't really talk about technology because their solution was still live with less. We all need to have less.
Right. Why do you think there's such a strong bias in the first place against nuclear?
So, I mean, I think it's several things, but the main thing is there is an old fear of nuclear not everywhere, but in a lot of Western countries, where there was a real fear of the bomb. People who grew up, I don't have memories, right, of that period. I wasn't alive during the Cold War. I wasn't I didn't like assimilate that fear, but I spent a lot of time around these old school protesters, like the elders, we call them the elders, right? Who we saw as very wise and very nice, kind people. And they had this fear, like this intense fear, almost like, you know, when you watch a disaster movie, a disaster film, and you see the apocalypse happen, and it's almost always like some kind of nuclear thing, right? Like a nuclear, like something like The Road, complete oblivion. It is terrifying. I mean, of course it is. What makes it good viewing. They they tell these stories as if they lived through that, as if they've seen it, because you know they had seen images on TV of, you know, like atomic bombings and stuff like that. Not that I hadn't seen the images, but for me, I didn't grow up with a very real fear that that could happen to me, and they did. And those messages and those stories were passed down, and you'd hear them again and again and again. No one had to bring up nuclear. It was just those were the stories. And that was the only context I ever heard nuclear in for something like 10 years, like right through from teens to 20s. The only thing. And I had a fear. Like, I'll be honest, I had that fear. And it's not like I was seeking out watching these films. I wouldn't watch the films. I was terrified because I had been given the fear and the stories. And let's be honest, that you can show me all the studies you want, but the facts don't change people's minds. Stories do. And stories from like people you trust, people in your group. Oh man, I had that fear. I was so happy to let go of that fear. It was not an overnight process, but it was very
Is it through learning more that you were able to let go of that fear? Like knowing the facts more?
Yes and no. So
other stories?
Yeah. So basically, I mean, there aren't really good stories of nuclear. You know, there's a bit more in sci-fi now where they show nuclear kind of positively, but it's a background thing. You don't see good stories about it. But mine was overwritten because I knew an engineer who was like really into the technology, and I was good friends with him. And he also I actually met him through mutuals because he was kind of in the environmental, we were kind of maybe like on the cusp of the movement. So we had some stuff, like we had enough common ground, we had some stuff in common. And he would just talk to me about it. And I remember because, and he was much older than me, but I remember at the start, I would kind of go like, John, I don't want to talk about this. It's like, you're scaring me. I don't want to talk about nuclear. Why are you pushing nuclear on me? I remember later thinking, why did you react like that? Like, don't do that. You didn't like it when so and so did that to you in the Green Party. Like, you left because they did that. Don't do that to John. He's nice. So I'd go back. I'd always go back. Like, and I'd say, go on, tell me then. And he would tell me, actually, you know, no one died at Fukushima. And my mind was blown, right? My mind. So it was facts, but the facts had to come through me through like a person, through a storyteller, right? So then I looked at the fact and I was like, well, I'll be damned. I've been lied to. I've been outright lied to for 15 years. And then, after I heard all of these myths being busted, every single thing that I believed was wrong. And I was embarrassed because I'm out here. At that time, I was doing work in vaccine hesitant communities. And I had a chapter in my book on vaccines, which I got a lot of hate for, by the way, from the kind of eco-parenting community. But I put it in there because I thought it was important. And I remember thinking, I'm basically like the anti-vaxxer, but for nuclear. What am I doing? Holy crap. So I went back to the group thinking, I've had a revelation. I'm going to give them this gift because I was stupid, right? I was a naive. And I said, do you know what? I think we're wrong about nuclear. And it was like, who's got to you? You're a shill. Were you infiltrating all along? And I tell you what, that hurt my heart. That was horrible.
Yeah.
That is really hard to hear from someone that you consider to be like a sibling. And yeah, and I that was where I started parting ways with a lot of people. Well, before I'd then come out and speak about nuclear, I kind of already knew this is gonna be tough. But mostly I'm gonna get flack from haters who I don't know. I've had the hard stuff, which is the people that I cared about who have gone. They're all gone because they think I've been corrupt. To this day, they think someone got to me. I've been corrupted. I'm a shill. I'm doing it for the money. Something wrong with me. I betrayed them, and that will never change. That I've had to make peace with that.
And that's a very common thing I find, these kinds of accusations when somebody, maybe, especially if somebody they liked, went to the other kind of side of what they believe. For me, I'm not, I'm not a nuclear expert by any means. I am just a lay person who I have a pretty open mind about it. I don't think I have a fully made up mind about it. I have been sort of evolving in my thinking. I definitely had that fear, because I grew up with that fear and just hearing Fukushima and Chernobyl, and of course the bomb that was dropped. I certainly have a huge, and I think a healthy fear of it being weaponized, but I also see how effective it can be as an energy source. And so it's really, then it comes to balancing safety and trying to understand that a little bit more. So you hear of these incidents, and from my understanding, modern designs have made it much safer than it was during those particular incidents. Can you talk a little bit about, what makes it safer today than when we had these particular incidents?
Yeah, so a lot of it is things that we learned, which I know people will say we should have known that in the first place, and mistakes are unforgivable. But in the case of Chernobyl, let's start with Chernobyl. That was the worst disaster, right, in history that did lead
I
to.
lived close to it.
Right, yeah. So
So I have like 6 fingers, so
you have a superpower. Wow, what do you need that six finger for? Debatable.
that seems helpful. Yeah.
So um it's almost like if you can imagine everything going wrong with the technology, Chernobyl shows that, right? So you had a reactor design that just was not a good reactor. The RBMK reactor is not a good reactor design. They knew back then that like it's capable of exploding. Like this isn't good. It's capable of not cooling down easily. Like there are lots of flaws with this design, but the Russians wanted to build RBMKs, and they still have some, but they've been upgraded now so that they can't explode. So that could have even been done back then, I think, but they just didn't. And then they also pushed the limits of like the safety. So they were doing like safety tests, but they were pushing the limits and messing around, and they shouldn't have done that. And that also, again, that's human error. They shouldn't have done that. Reactor couldn't handle it. And then a third thing happened, which is why I say it's like the worst scenario of a disaster, which is that they didn't tell people. So literally this explosion has happened and there's loads of radiation, and they were trying to bring people onto site to try and fix it. No, you need to evacuate that area and you need to tell people. And because they then didn't tell neighboring countries, and they were finding out by measuring, like, oh, what are these clouds of dust? Oh, we're measuring high levels of radiation. That's terrifying. I understand that. That's terrifying, especially if you're nearby, but even if you're not. I mean, look what happened, in Germany as a response to that. So they did everything that you could do wrong, they did wrong. But what I would say now is all of those things have been fixed. So first of all, we don't build that reactor anymore. There are much better designs. There are brilliant designs. There are reactors that are not capable of, like, actually, this is a good example, is the Zaporizhia zone in Ukraine, because a lot of people have worried about that and said to me, well, what will happen? It's in a war zone. It might explode. It won't. It won't. Like it shuts down efficiently. That it's not an RBMK. It doesn't have those problems. The second thing is there is so much monitoring now, and that's because of that kind of secrecy. So now you're not allowed to have a nuclear problem without loads of monitoring. We know where the reactors are. We know if they're being, manned, staffed properly. We know if they're doing anything dodgy, because you've got many organizations like the IAEA who go there and they do site visits and they look around, they check everything, and they won't even approve a reactor design if the country doesn't agree to kind of certain safeguards. So there's loads of checks and balances in place that weren't there before. So there's that as
But
well.
they have to be followed, right?
They have to be
Since we
followed,
have
yeah,
humans.
sure, but because we're so good at detecting now, I mean, if you fail an inspection or something, you'll just get shut down, right? That's going to cost your country a lot of money. That doesn't happen, because every country wants to say we have a great working nuclear program, and also they don't want to just lose their electricity grid overnight. So we don't.
Well, we
So
also have kind of complicated geopolitical players
We
here
do,
too.
and yeah, and there's definitely a lot going on, but we're a lot better at recognizing all those things. But I think one thing that happens when you talk about nuclear disasters, and I've only really talked about Chernobyl because Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, people, I think, because I had this idea in my mind that they were like duplicates of Chernobyl, whereas actually, like, no one died. It wasn't the same at all. People were evacuated. In fact, in Fukushima, they found that they evacuated like a much wider parameter than they needed to. But there were some deaths after the Fukushima Daiichi power plant meltdown because people panicked and got into accidents. There's something like 600 deaths. Those were the associated deaths. So I think
Oh
that's
wow.
interesting because I think the panic and the fear of it, it's almost like more dangerous than the technology. Actually, they knew what to do. They, that, yeah, you can't avoid the fact that a lot of people died because of tsunami that happened. That was going to happen. There was nothing they could do about that. But the disaster, actually, it's a really good case study of like it being well managed. Like they got the area clear. They actually cleared way more than they need to, but because some people panicked, they did get into accidents, and that's unfortunate. And then because there was a study afterwards that said actually a lot of those people could have just stayed put. So maybe the government did overreact a little bit, but probably you want that more than the opposite. So whatever. But Japan then had the same reaction where they're like, okay, we've made a big mistake. We're going to shut down all our reactors, and now they've restarted them. They've restarted almost all of them. They're restarting them like currently going on because they've realized actually there's more danger from like blackouts and not having reliable electricity, especially because there's so much geopolitics, and it's better to have homegrown sources of energy than have to import from other countries because geopolitically things have gotten very complicated and you don't know what will happen tomorrow that would jeopardize like being able to heat or cool your home, which again arguably like more people will be harmed from that than from the nuclear meltdown that happened there. That's just
That's a
statistics.
really good point. I mean, there's the amount of effect that gas, oil has, needs, how much it affects geopolitically what countries do is significant. Like even if you look at Russia and Ukraine right now, I mean, there were all these countries that are really cooperating with Russia more so because of oil. Even the ones that are publicly against it are still buying oil from it, which fuels the war. Um, and as well as other players, right? That would take their power away, which I would assume would make them want to fight nuclear coming. Have you seen that happening?
It's interesting, isn't it? I see a lot of strange stuff happening, and my focus is very like it is the energy space, and sometimes it's not obvious why it's happening. But I'll give you an example. Um, a couple of years ago, I did some like videos and kind of thought pieces on the Fukushima wastewater release. I don't know if you followed any of that, but it's basically they had radioactive water stored, and it had some trace elements in it that they didn't want to just release, like tritium. And before they did anything with it, it was just sitting in these casks. And before they did anything, they wanted to make sure that they disposed of it the safest way. Now, all the scientific reports came out and said, you can just put this in the sea because the sea already contains all of this. Just do it like in stages. Don't just dump it all at once. It's safer than keeping it in these casks, which are going to start leaking at some point, right? So I'm like, okay, great. Look at the research, all fine. And then in the news, I see these like there were these protests in China where people were boycotting Japanese fish, and it was really hitting the Japanese fishermen. Like it was a real problem because they were saying they're releasing this water and it's killing like it's dangerous. And it's this old idea of like the three-eyed fish, the blinky, Simpsons blinky. I thought, wow, how is this? What is happening here? Because the funny thing about that is, and the Chinese government was, they were completely behind this. And then you had the Japanese government responded in a really cute way, I thought, which was that they went on to some of the government officials. I think the heads of the nation did it as well. Anyway, they went on live TV, and they ate fish from those regions to try and say like this is safe. So at least to reassure Japanese people, even if not like I don't know if it reached China or not. But the idea was to like reassure the world, I'm top level and I'm eating it. And I mean, it's great storytelling, right? He could have sat there and reeled off these scientific facts, but we both know that wasn't going to change anything. And he did this periodically And I kept seeing that in the news, like in the Japanese news. I thought, that's really good. He's reassuring people, showing that that it's safe, blah, blah, blah. But I thought that was really interesting because China has a huge nuclear program. Like, China is not an anti-nuclear country. But when I looked at like what they were reporting, it was all about like, this water's not safe, nuclear's not safe. That's the implication. Nuclear's not safe. Radioactive water. It was all this like nonsense. And I thought, what's happening there? And I did a bit of a deep dive into that, and basically just seems like it's just a way to hit their economy. That's all it's about. It's not about nuclear at all.
That's
And
really
it's captured
interesting.
people globally, because globally we all have these fears. So, and I had to look into it. I didn't know straight away when I saw the wastewater release and all the campaigners saying the wastewater release, and I went and looked into it. I said, really? This is a nothing burger. Seriously, like, where is this coming from? It's like propaganda.
So I heard about this, but I didn't hear, I guess, the full context of what's being released into the water. I think there was for a time this fear about eating anything that came out of Japan, like fish that came out of Japan, specifically because I think the way it was sort of connected was that they had an incident, and therefore now it's like I think like what's interesting is as I think about it, it's like I didn't really understand even why. Just knew there was this like warning, this fear, and I think did kind of avoid eating Japanese fish for a while.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, that it really took a toll on the Japanese fisher people, and I thought that was a
lot
real
of stories.
shame.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot of stories that I'm hearing, and I haven't substantiated them myself, but also about like Russia specifically funding green groups to go against nuclear.
So this is another thing that I've been really interested in. What I would say is, it's difficult to make that exact claim, but we do know that there have been disinformation campaigns from Russia which have funded like activists, and specifically environmental activists. And the link that I saw that was proven was that it was happening against fracking. Now, again, like fracking, a homegrown, something you can have at home. Like, yeah, right, it's fossil fuels, but you're either going to use it at home or you're going to import it from somewhere else. And there was a lot of funding that went into these disinformation campaigns, and that was kind of exposed. Off the back of that, I actually theorized that, did they do this for nuclear too? Because I've seen like China using nuclear, because instantly it gets in our brains. Like, if you're in the West, instantly, you know, I've got family in India, and they couldn't care less. If you tell them you're building a nuclear plant in their neighborhood and it's going to give them jobs, that is like a day of celebration for them. They could not care less about all of the stuff that we have grown up with and absorbed so much that when you then hear something new about wastewater or something's happening in the war zone, you just believe it, and it terrifies you, because it's so core to like our culture, if you like. The way they've shaped our culture, and through pop culture as well, and things like The Simpsons and all the disaster films and so on. So that like the exact link isn't proven, but the kind of idea is there that it adds up. And if you look at what those campaign groups were doing, yeah, they were going very anti-fracking. They were also going very anti-nuclear. Was that only because they had fears of it? Well, no, I don't think so. Because if you think about it, it's not a very rational fear. Like, I understand that fearing the bomb is rational, but if you think about things that people fear, you shouldn't fear nuclear more than fossil fuels. Because let me tell you, fossil fuels kill millions of people. I'm not saying get rid of them overnight. I don't think that's possible. I'm not saying they're the root of all evil. They lifted us out of poverty, right? You can hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. But they do kill millions of people. And there's a great chart on Our World in Data, if you haven't seen it, which is like Oxford University data, where they map like what are the safest, cleanest sources of energy. And it's all like coal, oil, gas at the top. We know coal's the worst. And then at the bottom, it's like solar, nuclear, wind. And the numbers, you combine all the clean energy numbers, and it's absolutely nothing. It's a few thousands. And that includes all the nuclear disasters that have ever happened. And then you look at the millions, and that's not including climate change impacts. That's only including deaths through, gas explosions or oil spills or like air pollution that has been directly linked to coal-fired power stations, stuff like that. Then you realize, oh, why do we have this? Like, it's an irrational fear, really.
Yeah,
And so
the oil tankers, there
yeah,
was one recently that was like a pretty significant environmental damage as well. And so they're not necessarily very safe to like as in
no,
terms of
and
transporting.
the funny thing is, if you look up like gas explosions, oil leaks, there are so many that you don't even hear about. Like, you don't even, I've looked them up before just to kind of like make an argument to someone who was saying, no, those statistics must be wrong. Nuclear's got to be above fossil fuels. And I was like, no, look at all of these examples. And they couldn't believe it. And even then they were like, is this a conspiracy? Is this covered up? I don't know. Maybe people are paid not to report it. I don't know. Or maybe it's just so, it's like car accidents. It's so commonplace, right? That whereas if something out of the unusual happens, so yeah, all right, we have had 3 memorable nuclear disasters, but since the beginning of the technology, then it becomes like a big story, and we're going to tell that, and we're going to focus on and put all our focus on that. Almost like we want a disaster because it's so much good news reporting. It's so clickbaity, isn't it? Whereas with fossil, we've just kind of accepted like fossil fuel. And I say this about waste because I used to fear waste. I was wrong about waste. I thought waste was like a goopy acidic liquid. It's not, right? It's solid, and it's stored in casks, and is really a tiny amount of high level waste. Is a really tiny amount produced. Like all the high level waste in the world would fit in like a single football field. I think it was a 11-story high building, something like that. Anyway, but that's not what I thought. Like, it's leaking in the oceans. I had like a Simpsons type idea, mostly again because if I go back and I look at Greenpeace leaflets and all the other kind of messaging I was getting before, which they still put out, but I don't look at anymore, not deliberately. That's what they're using, and those are the pictures they're using, and they're like green, they're like bright yellow cans that are leaking with green liquid. And it's like, oh, that's why I believed that. But I've actually been and seen nuclear casks and been like, you know what, actually these are really ridiculously safe. And they test these casks by flying planes into them. The planes don't make it. They've even flown, there's a YouTube video you can watch of a missile. If you put in like missile being flown into nuclear cask, the missile just like dissipates in thin air, and the cask doesn't even move. That's how almost over the top. But
Right.
look, it's safe. It's dealt with. But what I would say to people is, so I've mentioned nuclear, and the first thing you say is waste. But why isn't that the first thing that you say when I say coal or gas or oil, when I say fossil fuels? Because that waste isn't stored. It's not protected in casks. We're breathing it in. It's in our lungs. That's not an exaggeration. That's scientific fact. It's in the atmosphere. It's in the Earth's atmosphere. That also is a scientific fact. This is not well-managed waste. But we don't think of waste. We don't think of the waste. We don't think of the air pollution, the invisible killer that's air pollution. We think of radiation, whereas the likelihood that you'll ever be exposed to that much radiation that would harm you, you're more likely to be exposed to radiation that will help you because we use it in nuclear medicine.
What about concerns around uranium mining and plant decommissioning?
So, like, safety concerns. I mean, I think there have been issues with mining in the past, and I think this probably happens for most industries. But you've got to do it safely with uranium mining. But again, those case studies, they're out of the norm. So the main kind of exporters, the main countries that have a lot of uranium are doing it safely. They are monitored. Canada, Australia, the top kind of regions are doing it safely. But that's not to say there haven't been. There have been issues. There have been issues of like people being kicked off the land because they want to mine there, like indigenous populations being removed and all that stuff. But that's not a nuclear problem. That's just like any big industry problem that happens with literally every product that is around you in your home. Has been, if it wasn't grown, it was mined, right? If it wasn't grown, it was mined, and that happens with everything. And that's where I think you need to have really strong safeguards protecting communities and people watching what's happening, which I think that's the thing that people don't realize with nuclear, is that because we've had the disasters and because there's so much fear, everything is watched. Like, if there's something happening in some mine somewhere right now, it will be in the news tomorrow. It will. Whereas, like, as I was saying, if it happens in the with fossil fuels, you won't probably hear about it. It's
I guess
unlike.
my concern is like, okay, so you've got what you're saying is there's a lot more of a watchdog activity going on. There's much more care, especially in certain countries. So I'm sure Japan, I can trust Japan, Canada, Germany. I guess my worry is that, well, what about the countries that might not care about public, they're not part of the coalitions,
Well,
they're not.
yeah, but I mean, again, who would, if there's some country nefariously secretly mining uranium, right? This is a controlled substance. Like, you have to be
Maybe
safe.
not even secretly.
You have to be safe
Like,
about it. But who would buy
mhm.
it? Like, that whoever buys it, instantly they're the bad guys. Instantly that's in the news. Somebody somewhere finds out, because you're going to have a whole population, if they're not doing it safely, who are being exposed to uranium. Like, I think that it's another one of those things where people fear the idea of uranium because they fear the bomb and they fear radiation. And, like, yeah, we should fear those things. That's the bomb works because it's scary, right? But there are so many watchdogs and so many safeguards. You have bodies like the IAEA going everywhere, looking at everything that's happening and reporting back. And they will report if they think it's negative. And they did that during the Zaporizhia crisis, where the not the CEO, what they call him the Director General, Rafael Grossi. He went to Ukraine and he went to that site and he said, this has to stop. Like, this is not safe to do this in this zone. Like, they're very honest. I wouldn't say they're like just pro-nuclear. I think their tagline is something like atoms for peace, something like that. Something like that, anyway. But for peaceful.
But do they have to listen to them? I mean,
no, they don't. But then they can cut off supply chains. They can exert pressure. They can say, this country, we don't think, because they deal with every country in the world that has a nuclear program or wants to have a nuclear program. They'll say, well, we don't think that you should work with that country anymore because they don't pass our safeguards. So they are really, like, ridiculously involved, and it's very transparent. I think a lot of people don't realize, but you can go on their website and have a look at, like, all the things they're doing, and it's very reassuring. I think if you're worried, what I worry about is we don't have those safeguards for the fossil fuels. We don't have them. Nuclear in the UK and the US, nuclear is more strictly regulated than coal. Do you know that? The nuclear industry is more strictly regulated, and that's because our fear has kind of pushed those regulations, just like our fear shut down reactors in Germany, and Belgium and wherever people reacted badly. But actually, quietly in the background, fossil fuels just continue to thrive, and almost always when the nuclear plants are shut down, fossil fuels just get switched back on. So it's a more deadly solution, even if you account for, like, every impact on every person through the nuclear cycle from mining. Because they do map this, and they map it for solar and wind as well. So if you look at those stats for, like, who's harmed, sometimes someone will fall while installing a wind turbine. That gets mapped. So, like, from each. The funny thing is, though, there's less transparency for wind and solar. That's not like dunking on wind and solar, but there is less transparency, mostly because we can't manufacture anything. And like the solar cycle, most of the solar chain is controlled by China. Like, they've got the rare earth materials, they do the manufacturing, like, most of it is controlled there, and then we just buy the product because we can't manufacture here. It's just not economically viable at all in any way. Like, we just can't do it. So we will just buy them from there. And it's weird because no one ever talks about the mining, and I've heard people say, oh, but it's free energy, it's so clean. And I'm like, these are made in huge factories by workers who we don't know if they were paid well or not. If it's made in Britain, I know they're paid well, because we have the checks and balances, we have the watchdogs. And if anyone tries to circumvent that, and sometimes maybe someone will, it will be all over the news, and that's their world is over, right? Like, that's how it works here. I trust that to happen, absolutely. But I don't know I don't know who made these. There was some reporting you can look up which said that they found solar panels being made in Uyghur camps. Right? Like there is reporting there's in the Guardian. It was reported across the news. I don't know personally about that story. Like, I haven't been there. You know, I'm not because
Sure.
I try to be careful because there's a lot of China bashing, and I try to be careful of like how I'm framing stuff. But I'm just saying, like, sometimes we don't have the checks and balances, but we pretty much know where that is, and it doesn't tend to be like the poorer country. Like, I think we have this idea like it's the poorer countries, the terrorists. Not really. You know, if you have the expertise to have high level tech, which is what nuclear is, you can't just go and make a reactor in your backyard. You can't just make a bomb, right? Like, it takes a lot of materials, equipment, expertise. And then you're saying people are trying to do it secretly, and you've got to mine the raw material and have all the things to keep you safe while you're doing that. Like, it's actually a really complicated, difficult thing to do. You almost can't do it without lots of kind of people seeing what you're doing or having input into what you're doing, which isn't the same for all forms of technology, which is why we can just buy these blades and we can just buy panels, but we don't really know who made them or what the mines look like or where they are. We don't know. We don't know any of it. All we know is that we get an end product that we can use and then replace. So I'm very much for like manufacturing what we can at home, because I know we have really high labor, safety, and environmental standards. And the US does.
That's a really great point. You know, I think my kind of takeaway from our conversation is that the fears around nuclear are not necessarily consistent with the facts around nuclear safety. But sure, you know, I can understand why somebody like me or other people might, you know, not having seriously looked into it, or you know, being susceptible to TV and so on. However, it makes it difficult. Like, surely somebody within governments, experts, people who work in the energy field would know the facts around this. Why is there still that like hesitancy?
Well, let me tell you something. When I started doing nuclear advocacy, so I don't work for the industry, right? I have no ties with the industry. They do not pay me anything like that. When I first started doing the advocacy, I approached it as an activist because I'd been in environmental groups. There's lots of art and music and theatre, like be loud, go to the beach, do a protest, placards. So I was like, yeah, what are the slogans? I use slogans that like everyone uses now, widely used, that I just like came up with. No, but the thing that surprised me at the time is this is working, this is catching on. People actually want to know this stuff. Why? Like, it's really easy. Why hasn't anyone done it before? Now you have lots of people doing it, lots of nuclear influencers and stuff. When I started out, it was very, you know, who's paying you? Why are you doing it? How odd? What's wrong with her? Why would an environmentalist do this? And I just found it really interesting because I organized a beach rally. It wasn't even a protest. It was a positive thing. So we weren't protesting anyone there. And we were trying to, like, the message was like, we're rallying behind Sizewell C. So it's a power plant site in Britain where they're going to build a new reactor. It's signed off now, but at that time it wasn't. Like, and we were trying to get it signed off. So we were like, this constant protest there against the reactor, not from local people, but from like second homeowners from London who come down, like celebrities, get lots of press. Local people who we spoke to really want the jobs there because it's in Suffolk. It's like there's not a lot there economically, right? Like, they've lost a lot of their automation, like most of Britain has. And so they're happy. Like, they've got a power plant there. Most people there know someone who worked there or had a family member work there. So they're like, yeah, we want another reactor. So I was like, this is really easy. All we need to do is like get their voices heard, get some so I thought, why don't we do the UK's first pro nuclear rally? So I organized this, just like, we're going to go down, get the train down on the beach, burgers, you know, food, get your swimsuits, we'll go for a swim in the sea. And that was partly because the anti-protesters were saying it's not safe to swim in the sea there because there's a power plant, which is obviously just complete nonsense. But, you know, as you know, these things do, you know, people kind of assimilate the messages.
Infect our minds.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I was like, we'll go and swim. And we did. And we had these like giant inflatable bananas. We like swimming. We did get new media coverage and stuff, which was the point. But the interesting thing is, and this answers your question, the industry, right? The industry, EDF, emailed me and said, "Dear Zion, we see you're doing this event and we advise you not to do it." So I'm doing them a favor, right? And they're actively telling me not to do it. So I not only had aunties on my back, right? And like all of my previous tribe people that I hung out with, the people who are supposed to be on my side, who I get accused of working for, emailed me to say, "We don't think you could do it. We don't think you should do it because
Why?
we think it could, if it goes badly, it could be negative press." And I replied very heated, what could possibly make nuclear have a more negative and image? Like, what could possibly? I couldn't believe it. And this was their comms, Catherine. This was their comms department. They are so afraid of backlash and of doing. I'm just gonna say it. They're afraid of doing comms. People say the nuclear industry is bad for this, they're bad for that. I actually think their biggest failure is the failure to do the communication to get people on board, the non-nuclear engineers, the non-physicists, on board with what this technology is and what it can offer us and how it's done safely and why we can trust it. And they do a lot around safety, but still I would say a lot of it is like, it's not appealing. It's very technical. It's not appealing or reaching to like normal people, like non-scientific kind of average person. And I had an argument with them, and they said, well, why don't we send some security down? Because what we're seeing in like the local groups, because they're all based down there, right? So they're like, what we're seeing in the local Facebook groups is that people are going to turn up to counter protest your rally. And I was like, good, bring it on. We'll offer them some bananas. We'll have a cup of tea. What? But I'm a seasoned protester, so I was not worried. And it was 4 people, and they were all quite elderly. Like, it was fun. And we did actually talk to them, and we gave them some badges, and we had some conversations. There was no one was fighting. There was no war on the beach, So their own fear was so overblown, when actually we had loads of people turn up who just were interested and wanted to learn, and were like, this is great that you're doing this, because we have questions, we don't know where to go, we don't know who to ask. And I'm thinking, that's the problem. They have refused to do the comms, and then what has happened is all of the communication about nuclear has been done by the people who are against it. All of it, 100% of the narrative was written and controlled. Waste, 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 Chernobyl, waste.
So it feels like public sentiment is then against it because of what they're not hearing the full story, and therefore politicians would be even if they know that this is the better way to go, they'd be hesitant to put that out on their platforms or enact that into.
But when I started doing that in Britain, and as I say, no one was doing it, but it'd never been done here before, and I was just kind of curious, like, yeah, maybe I'll get a lot of backlash, or maybe people will want to listen. Most people were just kind of like me, kind of like curious. They had some questions. Often it would be about waste, but sometimes it was other things. Just like normal questions. We did these stores where we went around big cities, London, Bristol, and we just gave out free bananas, and we just answer people's questions. It's literally all we did. I got a bunch of nuclear workers who like volunteered. They were like volunteers, young people who came to these events. They weren't doing it as like a work thing. They came because I said there might be technical questions that you can answer, but actually it wasn't really about that. It was about the fact that I've met you. You're not a monster. You don't have 6 fingers. Actually, you're quite likable, which they all are, right? They're all like professionals. They're nice people. And we gave out 100. I remember one event, we had like 300 bananas, and they were gone in an hour. And it was just like that. I filmed some footage where there was a queue of people waiting to ask the nuclear workers questions. It was incredible. Some of them I could kind of go and speak and I could answer, but I just thought, wow, people need this outreach. And actually 99% of them go away saying, yeah, actually I agree, thanks for that, I just didn't know. And the thing, I think the problem is what you'll get with a lot of industries, not just nuclear, but a lot of industries, they'll say, oh, well, they could find it on our website. Nobody's looking at your website. Nobody, and if they did, they think it's propaganda. They need to actually see real human faces doing outreach.
So they trust them, so they can assess them, whether they believe them.
Yeah, but once I realized that they had actively been, I mean, they tried to stop me and I'm not even in it. I realized they actively, like, it was a purposeful thing. And I think that was where they really went wrong. But what happened with just a three years of this campaigning that I was doing, the polls started to show people changing position, mostly in favor of nuclear. And it went up and up. And then suddenly the government changed position. And they became very vocal, and Sizewell C got signed off, which was kind of when I went, okay, I've done this. I'm going to have a look at other parts of Europe because Britain's okay. Like, we're, in terms of public sentiment, we're okay.
How do you fund your initiatives, given that you're not tied into industry?
Yeah, so I mean, so during that time, I did a lot of public speaking, which was paid for, and writing. So that it wasn't just these events, but I think the events just show that, like, people just really wanted that information, and there was a deficit. And what would happen is, if you didn't give it, they would go to a Friends of the Earth stall over there and get the information from them. And that actually, some of the events we held were in locations where we knew that the anti-nukers would have their own setup, which was really interesting. People walking past saying, "You're not the same people, are you? Okay, let me ask you this, because they told me that," and they would believe us because we had a bunch of scientists with us, you know. Anyway, yeah, so I did a lot of articles, and I went to 2 major newspapers here, and I said, I've gone through and I've analysed every nuclear article you've ever written, and every single one in the last 30 years has been negative. Oh, well, we don't think that's true. And I'd say, look at this piece, look at that piece, almost always ending quoting an anti-nuker. You never quote people who work in the industry or the families who live near the plant. Made all these arguments to these two. I tried it with several editors, but it was 2 that kind of listened to me when I was in the news a lot at the time because I'd been in Extinction Rebellion and stuff. I said, will you let me write your first ever pro-nuclear piece? But when I say pro-nuclear, it really wasn't. It was just being fair. Like, can I talk about it fairly, where you're not quoting the antis saying it's going to kill us all? I mean, come on, some of the stuff that they were saying, I said, if you're reporting this, oh, well, it's a quote. They'd say, it's a quote. Well, I'm giving you a quote. Can you quote me? And 2 of the 2 major papers said yes, and I wrote the first fair pieces. And after that, there was a cascade of reporting. I think because a lot of people saw it and went, oh, finally, something decent. And actually, also, I think people are a little bit fed up at that specific time of activists, because it was kind of on the, like, downward trajectory of Extinction Rebellion. They lost a lot of support, too many road blockades, too many protests that upset people. So they were a little bit like, we actually want to hear the science. We're a bit fed up of activists. And that's when, like, these 2 articles landed in the same week in these mainstream papers, completely, like, took off, went viral. And then suddenly lots of journalists started writing about them. And my articles here somehow went all the way to Australia. And I had Sky News in Australia saying, will you come on and talk about this article you've written in Britain? Because we've got a nuclear ban. We mine a lot of uranium, but we have a ban on building nuclear technology. They have AUKUS, right? They have AUKUS, like nuke subs, but they have a ban on building, like, civil nuclear for energy. So I was like, yeah, okay. And then a huge debate kicked off there as well. So actually, you know, the comms works because people just want the information. It just needs to be done. It just needs to be done. That I know it sounds really simplistic, but that was my experience. And now there are so many people doing it because, you know, scars on my back from the early days when I was attacked a lot in those early days. It was hard. It's not like that anymore. And you can talk about it without being told you're a shill and all this other stuff. But no, and also, just to fully answer your question, I did have some funding as well. There was an entrepreneur in Switzerland who reached out to me and said his 2 parents, both parents, nuclear physicists, elderly now, like in the 80s. And he said, you know, our greatest wish was, like, to see this technology take off, and it's so sad for them. And I fund a lot of startups. Would you be interested in having some funding? And that was brilliant because I was like, yes. It was only it was like a short period.
Yeah.
Yes, because it enabled me to go and buy 600 bananas, which is the sort of thing I did, and, like, you know, set up events and stuff. And B, no strings. Like, he never ever told me one thing that I should or shouldn't say. He was completely like, off you go then. And I just did it. Yeah, his contributions made more of a difference because I wouldn't have been able to do it with just the public speaking and the writing. But that is mainly, now how I fund my work, but not at that time.
It's certainly harder, I would say, to fundraise for, again, because of that sentiment. But
Yeah.
if you think about it, if you are somebody who supports, a healthier climate, um, it makes sense to
Yeah,
support.
and that's the Swiss guy. That's completely his reasoning. He was like, I know you care about climate change. My parents are nuclear physicists. Do you want some money? Yes, please. That's going to help me a lot, and it will allow me to retain my independence, which is just really important for me personally.
Mhm. For sure. And when you're speaking to people and you're like not part of that, of the industry side of it,
Yeah,
I think that
yeah.
gives it so
Because
much more
he's not. I mean, he's
authenticity.
very like you can look him up online. He's very public. He's not tied to any, except for his parents were both once kind of nuclear physicists. But I
Yeah.
think that
Well,
adds
that's,
to the authenticity because they actually have books that they've written on it, like
yeah.
very scientific books because they're PhDs. Um, yeah. So for me, that reasoning completely tied up. And to be honest, for me, that's a massive relief coming from like activist spaces. Like, oh, you just want to get the science out there. Yes, let's please fund more science communication. Everybody whines about misinformation and like fake news, but who's funding the measures to stop this? And there are loads of measures. There are loads, masses of research on how to solve these problems. But if you're not paying for it, it's not happening. And you still have scientific institutions, some that I know of, who are like, well, we don't really need to do the comms, doesn't matter. But then you're complaining about how much misinformation is out there. Who's going to take on this job of like trying to fit? I used to do it for vaccines, then I did it for nuclear. I've done it a little bit for GMOs. But every time when I see results, I think, well, if we just had a lot more people doing this, that problem is solved. That's not overly optimistic. We know how to solve these problems, but someone somewhere has got to fund them.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you see, are there any other alternative energies that you see as being kind of players, or do you think nuclear alone is the way to go?
I mean, I think I wouldn't say nuclear alone. I normally say just clean energy is good. So any
Hmm.
good grid, healthy grid, something like France, good example of a grid. Lots of nuclear, some solar, some wind, tiny
Hmm.
bit of fossil fuels now. They're building more reactors. Or if you're blessed with hydropower, then yeah, you can have dams. You can do what Sweden did, mostly um, hydropower with a little bit of nuclear and a little bit of solar and a little bit of wind. Um, Obviously, still think we need to wean off fossil fuel. Like that to me is just a no-brainer, and it's not about they're evil or anything like that. They gave us a lot, but we've got to have a balance, and they're taking away a lot. And if we look at what's viable, like how can we do this, what's the scientific consensus, and what are the case studies, we know how to do it because we can see the countries that have done it. I mean, France decarbonized in the 80s by building 50 plus reactors. In 10 years they built 50 plus reactors. It seems unimaginable now, right? Because
These are also countries
building anything.
that are, yeah, that they're also like France doesn't have necessarily oil. So I'm just thinking about like a
Yeah,
country like Canada, for example, where
actually,
it's,
yeah, actually it's interesting because I'm glad you said that, because actually it was during the oil crisis that their prime minister at the time, Pierre Mesmer, said, like, we need a plan, like we need to solve, what are we going to do? And there was a saying at the time which was, we don't have oil but we do have ideas.
mm,
And from that, he kind of proposed, like, what if we just build loads of reactors? Obviously wind and solar tech wasn't as good then as it is now. Now they have more wind and solar, but at that time it was like, that is the best kind of homegrown, and then it lasts 60 plus years. Like, we will have independence for a long time. And they just, yeah, built them in 10 years, basically decarbonized their grid, while everyone else is kind of still 30-40 years later say, how do we do this? No, they did it.
mhm,
We could do it, and they did it in 10 years. There are some countries doing it, to be fair, like the UAE. Interesting example, the UAE has a lot of oil, right? Very oil rich country. But
mhm,
a few years ago, about a decade ago, they set a net zero goal by 2050, which is good, right? I know people are like,
mhm,
oh, they're fossil fuels. Well, they're choosing to wean off those. That's good, surely, in any measure. And they commissioned their scientists to do a report, like, what's the best way to do this? And the report said, follow the French model, basically, like follow that model. And they said, we don't have any nuclear. We're not allowed. We don't have like the nuclear allowance. We don't have any expertise. We don't have an industry. So they opened a bid for other countries to come in with their nuclear expertise, like, and they get lots of money for it. Show us how to build them, train our engineers, set up an industry from scratch. So in 10 years, they went from having no industry, right? Like no expertise or very little expertise. And South Korea, who have a really good track record, right, with nuclear, very safe. They build great reactors. They have really, you're talking about reactors before in terms of safety. They have one of the safest designs, right? APR 1000. Like, this is a really good reactor, and they've refined it so that they can export it really easily. So they're like, we'll do this for you. Came in, trained the engineers, set up a nuclear industry, and built 4 nuclear reactors, which now meet 25% of the country's electricity needs. This is a country of like, what, 10 million people? And yeah, they did that in 10 years. They went from having nothing, which I just think is extraordinary, because, I mean, we're trying to build a reactor here, right? And this is a country where a lot of people support the technology, and it's something like 10 years delayed. And when it comes online, it will be the first one in, like, I think it's 30 years or something that we'll have had come online. It's ridiculous how much we have stalled and lost the ability to build stuff because we've become so obsessed with safety and so, like, risk averse. And other countries which haven't had that history, they're just like, 10 years, we'll just do what France did in the 80s. And now they're building more reactors.
It's really interesting that they've decided to go that way because they export all that oil. Yeah. I imagine that is a big hindrance for it would be interesting for me to hear what their thinking behind that. Is it just to kind of future proof? Because again, bringing up Canada just because it's resource rich, very big chunk of land. I imagine they wouldn't want to give up
I think
that revenue source.
Yeah,
right?
I think what that is more to do with is just pressure, isn't it? It's global pressure. Like, there was a real moment where you had countries like competing against each other, who can reach net zero earlier, which is a ridiculous concept. Anyway, let's be honest. Which came from Extinction Rebellion, by the way. We came up with that net zero. It was one of our 3 demands. Yeah, we had 3 demands, and one of them was for every country and council and like municipality to declare a climate emergency and a net zero goal. And those 2 phrases, net zero, climate emergency, wildfire, spread like wildfire. Most people don't even realize it came from this little media messaging team at XR. It shows you how good their comms is. But yeah, like, there's no net zero. Like, we can't just get rid of oil. That's not going to happen. All we can do is reduce it as much as possible. And I use the example with that of Lego. Like, do you know Lego spent so much money because they wanted to replace their products, replace the oil in their products. And they tried all these different other things. They tried PET, they tried like lots of different substances, and they basically said, yeah, we could do it, but the carbon footprint of doing it is so much higher. Like, we're just going to stick with the oil, which I thought, credit to them, because they could have just virtue signaled and said, yeah, we're now fossil fuel free, right? But actually, the stats, they released this information, and it was like, it's so much more polluting. There's more mining, there's more materials. Like, it's so much more polluting to use the alternatives. It's really hard to wean off oil, like really hard. Even for like a small venture like that, you think that's doable. And that's what they thought when they went into it. They spent lots of money trying to do it. And then I had to admit that, like, we don't know if we can achieve this. But I think that everyone has felt that pressure. So even the oil-rich countries have felt that pressure, and they're like, yeah, trying to look at what's happening. What happens next? What happens if these countries attain these goals and they don't want to buy our resources anymore? We need to like work out ways around that. And to be honest, there is a lot of research showing you build a lot of nuclear, it's good for your economy. And you can look at France, you can look at South Korea's economy is booming. This is a small country which doesn't have a lot to. If you look at how does South Korea compete with China, right? Like, look at who they're competing with, because they have a solid nuclear reactor, solid industry, and they're now exporting that to multiple other countries. Where did they just sign a deal with? Was it the Netherlands? Can't remember. Anyway, they just signed, like, they're signing deals left, right, and center. People want their reactor because they know they'll come in and they'll just get it done. But yeah, they're one of the biggest exporters of the technology in the world. it's just clever. I think anyone who's looking forward, I'm not saying that people are doing this out of the goodness of their hearts, they want to reach net zero. It just makes sense. It's almost like, I know it's going back to something that it's not a new technology, but we kind of forgot how good a technology is because we got so caught up with all the scary stuff. Like we're saying, we understand that, but actually, I don't think we're going to suddenly stop trying to wean off fossil fuels. And I know America's in a different place, but in Europe, it's still, even if we're not going to hit net zero, those goals are there because it means we're advancing towards something, which is that we all know how polluting fossil fuels are, particularly coal. So even if it's just replacing coal with gas, right? And then, we have case studies to show where, like Germany, where they had plans to phase out coal, but they also phased out nuclear, and then they couldn't meet the coal needs because you can't just do it with wind and solar. Like, it's not possible. Not for an industrialized nation. Maybe for like a village could do it, right? But not for an industrialized nation. Nowhere has been able to do it, and they spent trillions trying to. So that's the reason I don't just say we just can do it with wind and solar. I used to, because that was one of the checklists. Like, wind and solar will save the world. Free energy, tick. That's what I used to say all the time. Batteries around the corner. We'll have batteries any day now. Batteries require a lot of mining and lithium. Like, are we doing this for the right reasons, or are we just doing it because they're like football teams and we like one thing more than the other? For me, it's always going to land on like, what do you get the most out of with the least harm to the environment and the best for nature and for people?
Right. When I was in uni, as your people might call it,
Yeah, we do.
I took I took a course in effective communications.
Nice.
And I think this conversation and this topic, I think, is very revealing on the role that effective communication plays and ineffective communication plays. Do you see, where do you see things headed? Is it upward towards more nuclear?
Yeah, definitely. Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. So that UAE example, that's recent, and like I say, South Korea is now looking at building in other countries, which is it's just really useful for when those countries don't have that expertise, or like they've lost the capability to have experts come. I mean, of course, we know this makes sense, but the fact that there's now an option, because when they started out with the UAE venture, everyone was watching, going, will this work? Will it fit? It was a proof of concept, and then they did it, and it's all working and it's all good. So that alone is going to have repercussions. And because then you've also got lots of other countries now saying, maybe we should be competing, maybe we should be pushing our reactors. So, and essentially that's how it works, isn't it? It doesn't just work because governments like, oh yeah, I'm going to do the sensible thing, build nuclear. They do it because they see what's happening around them and who's making a lot of money through this and who's growing their economy. Poland has a huge nuclear program, which is great because they burned a lot of coal for a long time, right? And they're not just saying it, they're putting the money in and forming a plan. So yeah, there's loads of stuff happening everywhere. Japan's restarting reactors. There's only a few cases where countries have really ditched nuclear. Like, yeah, Australia still has a ban, but they're having a debate on it, which has been raging for some time now, for a few years. But that's good that they're having the debate, because then people can hear information, right, that they need to hear. Yeah, and across Europe as well. I know I hear a lot about like Europe stagnating and stuff, but it depends where you look. If you look at somewhere like Poland, again, punching well above their weight, like a brilliant economy. Their economy is just, they're having a great time. We're living with some difficulties here. We've had Brexit, we've had recession, we've got a lot going on, housing shortage, we've got a lot going on. But I look at Poland and I'm like, so many good stories of like trying to finally get rid of fossil fuels, burgeoning economy, lots of experts, actually partly because of Brexit. We called it like the mass exodus of Polish people went back, but actually a lot of them were like top level experts. So that expertise went back to Poland and then said, hey, actually this is like becoming a really good place to live. Yeah, there's a
reverse brain drain.
That's what they called it. Yeah, so they've really benefited from that because they've actually got some big startups there. They've got almost all the major tech companies with bases there, Google, Meta, etc. AI data centers. They're like It's amazing. There is definitely a lot of good stuff happening. It's just, what I would say is it's shifted, like things have shifted. And if you're only looking at a former empire, for example, it looks like a lot of things are on the downward. I'm not disagreeing with that. I live here, but some countries are really soaring, and like Italy as well. Italy's got a lot of AI data centers, got some big companies, and it's also got some big startups like Bending Spoons, which, you know, big tech unicorns. Again, like that's just, this is how we feel the world. But often it's that we get the tech first, and then we think, how do we now sustain this? And that's in all those examples, it's going to be nuclear, just because it is so powerful. The way it's moving now, you have a lot of countries building big nuclear, but you also have SMRs as well. So a lot of different startups competing to get theirs on the market, to get theirs out there. That'll be game changing when it happens. We've chosen Rolls-Royce over here. I don't know if you hear that announcement over there. Like the government's chosen Rolls-Royce as like, that's the SMR.
Okay.
Because we had loads of competing companies. Still,
so you're literally going to have the Rolls-Royce of Rolls-Royce.
yeah, well, they're very respected here. I wasn't surprised that they went with them, actually, but it was still kind of like everybody was waiting for this decision, and they announced it recently. So we're looking at small, and I know there's a lot of criticism of small reactors because they're not as powerful, but the theory is they're easier to build, right? They're more simplistic, and they're also much, like, degrees more safer. Like, they're not going to melt down. It's different technology, but they're just not at a stage yet where you can actually just put them anywhere and build them. But I think that'll be interesting to see what actually happens when someone learns that one will be in their neighborhood, because the way they work with a nuclear site, you can have it like miles away on the coast somewhere, like miles. The ones that I visited are like, there's no one living around these places, like they're miles away. But these could be, the idea is it'll power your neighborhood, so it could be smack down in your neighborhood. I think that'll be interesting in terms of like public sentiment, and whether they get the comms in on the ground first and have those conversations, or whether they'll just repeat the same mistakes. Sure. It remains to be seen. But I know a lot of countries now are going small tech, and every country is trying to, create the first brilliant SMR design that everyone's going to want. Everyone, Canada's developing a smaller version, aren't they, of your CANDU reactor, which again, CANDU's brilliant technology, but huge issues in Canada with being able to connect the grid up so that they can actually cooperate and make use of something like a single big energy source when you have such a diversity of different energy sources there.
Great. Well, I appreciate you being part of Forbidden Conversation and Conversations, multiple. And I'm wondering, can you tell us where to find you, where we can learn more about your work, and anything else you want to shout out?
Sure, yes. So I have a Substack, which is called Everything is Light. I mostly cover energy on there. I haven't been writing a lot on there at the moment because I'm writing a book, but that won't be out till next year. But I do still write on there. I'm on Twitter, X, as
Forever Twitter to me.
Well, I mean, Twitter felt very different to X. I do think of it as X. I do think of it as like X.
You're right.
It just
know what? You're right.
It feels different.
You're right.
So I'm on X.
It is different. Yes, I think you're right.
I'm on TikTok as well. Z Love Science. I post short explainers of different scientific topics, not just nuclear. In fact, nuclear is probably like not in my top topics. I've done a few videos on it and they've done well, but I cover all kinds of different stuff on there and breaking science news because it's interesting.
Great.
Yeah, that's where you can find me. And thanks a lot for having me. It's been a good talk, very interesting discussion.
Lovely to have you as well. And look forward to learning more. And I did subscribe to your TikTok today. So I am, I was watching some of the videos, and I think we definitely need more science education, less fear mongering, and just being more fact-based, evidence-based, and not so fear-based, which I think is hard. Like, I think there's something about us where even when we learn something not to be true, it's sort of done the damage. It's infected our minds. And of course, it can have very serious consequences, whether it's on government policy and what we do, or, with vaccines, for example, the hesitancy and all of that. so I think those are it is crucial and very important, and unfortunately it's not always done right, but I see a lot of people who are, or at least some people who are um, uh, reaching out to people in a way that I think uh, is helpful and can have a positive impact. So again, thank you for being on, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Okay, speak soon. Thank you. Bye.